I think people of color as well.
Mhm.
When I think about how we do genealogy, it's mostly through just asking our parents and asking our grandparents. And there is no database where we can go in and type in our name and trace it down and go all the way back. And do you think something like that is necessary in Africa? Let's explore how we do it now. Because how do African nations do it now? How do Black people do it now? How do people of color do
Mhm.
that same thing now? And what could we do to improve it in the future, I guess?
Whoa, that's lots of huge questions there. I'm going to try and remember all of them, but if I don't, then prompt me, please.
No problem.
How we can do it now, I mean, there are lots of online databases that have lots of records. For example, you do exactly what you said. You know, you speak to your parents, you get birth certificates for your parents, which then have their parents on it. You talk to them about the dates, where they were born, all of this sort of thing, and then you can search birth records or baptism records.
Mm,
And actually, what I found is that the registers of births, of marriages, of deaths in Barbados, for example, go quite far back. I found records in 1844.
oh,
There's
really?
records earlier than that. Yeah, I was surprised because I thought, I'm never going to be able to do this. But you
Mm,
can do that. There's quite a lot there for Caribbean islands. And that actually is on a website called FamilySearch, and that's free. That's provided by the Church of the Latter-day Saints, the Mormons. So there are records. And if we look at not a very pleasant record, but the slave registers, for example,
mm,
they are also free online. And also the records of who the plantation owners were are also there online as well. So you
mm.
can see how much they were paid for the slaves that they owned in order to free them. I think that's probably something we'll get onto a bit later as well.
Yeah,
But
definitely.
you can do that at that level in terms of the Caribbean. If we're thinking about Africa, it's really interesting because obviously places that were under British rule, under the Empire or French rule or European rule, will
Yeah.
have records. Now, whether they bothered to think that Africans were Christians and could be christened or could be buried,
Mhm.
you know, in different times, that was always a different issue. But there will be some records. But what I find really fascinating, and I'm absolutely jealous of, a lot of Africans have that oral tradition.
Mhm.
Mm,
So, you know, a friend of mine who's from Somalia, he can recite his lines back up to 15 generations. And
mm.
I would absolutely die to be able
Mhm.
to do that. And it's part of the culture to know who you are and where you come from. And I think that's absolutely really essential. And that is in common with why people were putting these pedigrees or these lists of their ancestors together, because originally it was so they could bear a coat of arms and they had to prove who they were, or they were inheriting an estate, so they had to prove that they were son of whoever who was son of whoever who was son of whoever. And in a lot of early genealogy, women didn't even get a mention. It's either just put wife, daughter, no names, but it was all about tracing where you came from and who your ancestors were.
Amazing. There's two parts that I wanted to explore. I don't know which direction to go. When you mentioned the Christian thing, I wanted to explore that and try to understand why. But then when you mentioned the thing about how Africans have oral traditions, I wanted to share
Mm.
something there too. But let's talk about why Christianity is so important in the beginnings of genealogy and like where it came from, like the beginnings of genealogy or genealogy. Where did it start? How did this become a thing? Because you said it started like 110 years ago. It's always been a thing because even in the Middle Eastern tradition, in the Arab world, people call themselves like Abu Yusuf or, you know, father of this person or son of this
Yeah.
person. Like it's always been a thing. But when did this whole turning it into an organization and into some sort of a structural institution, where did that come from?
That's a good question. And I think people have always done genealogy in whatever way, whether they've written it down or it's been an oral tradition. If you look at the Iliad or the Odyssey or these really ancient poems, they will say, I think Hector, son of Priam, I think it's Hector and Priam. But, you know,
Mhm.
so that's always happened. I think
Mm,
putting together a society of people who were genealogists was a relatively recent thing in terms of the Society of Genealogists. And there are many different types of societies across the world where people have come together to do this. I mean, if you look back in the Bible, if you think about, you can see beautiful stained windows of the tree of Jesse, and that
mm,
is the whole sort of genealogy of Jesus. And so this is something that's been happening as long as there's been a father and a son, because obviously the women didn't come along till quite a lot later. So people have always been interested in where they're from and
Yeah.
who they are. And obviously we look at royal lines, we look at kings and queens, it's been very important in that carving up a power in a sense of who do you give what to. And in terms of estates, I mean, there's been all sorts of rules about the first son gets this amount, the second son gets this, the last son goes off to war because there's nothing left for him. So that we've always had this sense of sort of hierarchy and family history in a sense of knowing who we are. And this is the whole thing about heraldry as well. If we look at coats of arms, and part of what I'm studying for my master's is also heraldry, which is really exciting because I've always wanted to dabble in that. So I've got a good excuse now.
Wait, heraldry, is that what in Game of Thrones when they're saying House of Stark? House
Yeah, it's the coat of
Lannister.
arms. Yeah, shows you which, originally I think it was for battle so that the knights could see which side you were on. Families are entitled to a coat of arms, but they have to prove that they're entitled to it through genealogy. This is what they've had to do sometimes and said, we are of this family and we can prove it.
Yeah. I think you mentioned that it had something to do with the Mormons in the beginning.
No, not in the beginning, but the Mormons believe that you need to trace your ancestors so that you can seal them into the church. So they have gone around the world and they have microfilmed or microfiched or copied birth records, marriage records, all of these records, and they've really been a huge spur behind, a huge driver behind a lot of genealogy. And the biggest genealogy conference happens in Utah, in Salt Lake City, at the end of February, beginning of March every year. And I've been really honored to go and speak there twice, and I'm going again in March.
Amazing.
They've got this huge library in a mountain where they've kept the records. I mean, I'd love to get in there, but I'm not high enough up to be able to get into that record mountain.
Interesting. So, Mary, did you have anything you wanted to share about this so far?
I was just reflecting on my own experiences when you were talking about we all kind of try creating our own family trees. And I've always got stuck when it came to my great-grandparents, and I've never been satisfied. Like, there's definitely so much more. And in my family, our surnames have changed according to status. And then we all eventually became Patels, and from India. And there's no official records even of my grandma's birth, etc. So I've always felt like there's no hope, but I feel like maybe there is. And I'm keen to learn more.
Oh, that's great. We start with births, marriages, deaths, and, generally those religious records or state records, because the state is recording that. But I think the thing about genealogy is if you go to the big sites, which I'm not going to mention for advertising, obviously, I don't know, I might be able to, it's not the BBC, but you put your details in and they give you this little green leaf that comes up and it's a hint that they might have found a record. And a lot of people start on that and get really enthusiastic and then just follow these hints and think they've built their family tree. And I have to admit, I did that. I got back to 1500 roughly following these hints. And now I've actually got to go back and do the real work. But I think one of the things about this is that it's actually a skill. It's something you have to learn about. You can do a lot with those birth, marriages and deaths, but you're then looking at things like, were there any directories of shops, of services, of anything like that maybe if somebody owned a shop, they would be in that directory. There's things like school records. In the UK, you've got things like poor law records. So if you were poor and you had to be given relief by the parish or you were given some money, then you would be in that record. There's just so many different types of records. If your family is in the military in any way, it's brilliant because they wrote everything down. You've got widows' pensions, you've got pay, all sorts of things. So it's about really thinking, what sort of records were around at the time, if there were any? It may be that there weren't, but how else were things recorded? How else did people know? And in some areas, you're not going to find anything. I don't think I'm going to get much further than 1800 in Barbados, because before that, it's going back to Africa. And that is really difficult to look at. People have done it, but it's a whole other story.
Yeah, definitely. I told you this earlier on, but I just wanted to share it again for the purposes of our listeners with regards to genealogy. I mean, I wasn't like crazy interested, but a few times when I was interested and I would speak to my mom about, her parents and grandparents and where they came from. So she understands where her parents came from and the areas that they came from. And it was one of the provinces in the Yoruba land that maybe, I think either not her parents, but her grandparents or great grandparents were part of the royalty or the Oba of those provinces. You know, Yoruba land is massive. There's an empire, but there's tons of provinces in that empire. Every province has like a ruler. And I think that's why there's this joke about Nigerians thinking, oh, they're a prince or you know, princess or whatever. But it's from that. And so she knows more about her side. But about my dad's side, she doesn't know much about it. But I think she did share because they're from similar areas, and they're from similar areas in Yoruba land, which is Igbaja. But her parents came from Oro, which is another nearby place. And she doesn't know much about what my dad does, but based on my surname, which means to bind something together that is very strong and not unbounded, I was estimating that, wait, does that mean we're blacksmiths? Were we creators of things? Were we like, yeah, basically making tools? But that's as far as I got with regards to this whole genealogy thing. I think if I was truly interested in it, I'd have to go disturb my dad as well and be like,